I think we're ready to go here this evening. My name is Chris Alden. I'm Professor of International Relations here at the department, but in this occasion, and most importantly, Director of Ideas. We're here to do one of the kind of classic events with our colleagues, Ignacio Garcia Acero and Charles Grant as a discussant. We're going to talk about something that's on everybody's mind. We've really nailed it, I think, well, and we're very pleased to have Ignacio here to address this. That is, of course, trade disruption, Trump's preferred tool for changing the world around him, his trade policy and the impact on the EU and the UK. So I think this is a great opportunity to open that up. Ignacio, of course, Garcia Acero is a former EU Commission Director of Trade and is a non-resident fellow at Yale and member of the Friends of Multilateralism Group and a visiting professor at University College of London since 2021. And I'd like to highlight he's also a fellow of LSE Ideas and has indeed given a lot of talks on the trade question in various forms in the previous year. So we're really pleased to have him here. Ignacio will speak first, and he'll be followed by Charles Grant, a director of Center for European Reform, the founder of the same, and has himself been published quite a number of issues, reports on the like, spoken on the topic of Russia, China, global governance, building a modern European Union, how Europe should handle China, and quite a number of EU foreign policy, Russia, China, and most importantly, Britain's relationship with the EU. He himself has also been a trustee of the British Council, formerly a member of the advisory board to the Moscow School of Political Studies, 2002 to 2015. So I am giving you just a snapshot on their CVs. They're very kind to let me run roughshod over it. But may I turn it over to Ignacio?
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Chris, and it's a real pleasure to be here back in LSE Ideas, not to talk about the WTO, but to talk about something much more troublesome, which is what we can expect to happen on trade with the election of Donald Trump as the President of the United States. What I would like to do in my presentation is first to make an argument that the type of challenge that we are going to be facing is fundamentally different to what we faced during the first Trump administration, and to explain why. Then I don't have a crystal ball, but I would like to give you a sense about the type of trade actions that one needs to be prepared to. I would then give my own recommendations about how the European Union should be responding to those actions. And finally, I will say a few words about how the UK and the EU should interact in this particularly challenging context. Now, let me start with the first argument. Now, I was in charge of relationship with the United States during the first Trump presidency. It was certainly a complicated relationship. It was certainly a degree of trade conflict that we have not experienced for quite some time with the United States. But I would argue it was not fundamentally different from the type of trade tension that every now and then have been there in the transatlantic trade relationship. We had protectionism in the steel sector, nothing very new. Every 10 years or so you have protectionism in the steel sector in the United States. In this particular case, it was labeled as national security action. By the way, I think it was a unifying factor. The member states were so outraged that they actually supported the European Commission to be ready to take rapid retaliatory action. Then on that basis, we managed to stabilize the relationship and to have basically talks about how to try to improve bilateral trade. There was, of course, a much more serious US-China conflict. But again, it was rather self-contained. It didn't have too much of a negative spillover effect on other aspects of the relationship. And we handle all of these basically through traditional trade policy diplomacy. Of course, with a very strong support from the top. The President of the European Commission at that point in time, Jean-Claude Juncker, went to the White House, had a discussion with President Trump and managed to avoid a further deterioration of the trade relationship. But that was it. Then it continued with discussions between the USTR, the Commissioner for Trade. So the whole issue could be to a large degree circumstanced as a trade conflict to be handled through the traditional tools of trade diplomacy. I think that what we are facing now, in my view, is a much more systemic, much more fundamental challenge. If you look at this from the trade point of view, there's of course the clear indication of the readiness to use tariffs as an all-purpose instrument for all kinds of trade and non-trade objectives. But I would argue this is not even, I would say, the most concerning element. I think the most concerning element is that this trade conflict happens within the broader setting of a rather structural crisis on the transatlantic relationships, which affects, I would say, the political relationship, the security relationship, foreign policy, and the economic policy. And my argument would be that it affects in a very similar manner the European Union and the United Kingdom. There are, of course, differences. I would say fundamentally the type of challenges that are being faced are of a rather similar nature for both the UK and for the European Union. Now, before going into trade, let me just go briefly a bit about how I would characterize this polycrisis affecting the transatlantic relationship. Now, there's the political dimension. Traditionally, the United States government has been supportive of centrist parties in Europe, whether from the right or from the left, which are in favor of European integration. Now we have a government in the United States which supports the extreme right of the political spectrum in the European Union, and which seems to be taking quite an ideological approach to relationship with countries in Europe, and not only in Europe. And of course, this is not just an external issue, because in all European countries, you have actually political parties that have a similar ideology to that of the current US administration. So I think this is a particular new political context, which of course is going to make it, I would say, more challenging to see how you react to these new developments. The second and rather fundamental dimension is the security dimension. You have now a situation in which during the campaign there have been indications that the United States could not maintain its security guarantees vis-à-vis the European Union. I mean, luckily, after the election, the signals which are coming are perhaps a little bit less concerning. But at the same time, we have to be ready to something which has never happened, to my knowledge, in the transatlantic relationship, which is cross-linkages between the security and the economic and trade relationship. That, at least for this almost 40 years I have been working on trade policy, I don't think that has ever happened. And that's a new world to which we have to be prepared. In my view, it is clear that the future of NATO depends on the European countries being ready to assume primary responsibility for their defense. And that, in my view, makes it absolutely of paramount importance to have a strong defense cooperation between the United States, between the European Union and the United Kingdom. I don't think it's any more a matter of choice. I think it's a matter, I would say, of first order necessity. Then we have, I think, the foreign policy challenge. In both European Union and United Kingdom have been conducting their foreign policy very much on the premise of support for the rule of law, of support for multilateral institutions. And now, of course, we have to be facing the world in which the United States is going to be either abandoning or rather fundamentally undermining the work of certain institutions which are of fundamental importance both for the UK and for the European Union. And I think in my view that raises a big political question, to what extent in that sort of context Europe is going to be investing political capital in keeping multilateralism alive. And that is going to require a big investment on diplomatic resources to restore trust with the developing world. Because at the end of the day, you want to make multilateralism work in very difficult situations. I think we are going to really have to engage in a dialogue with developing countries. And that, in my view, is also, quite frankly, an opportunity for the United Kingdom and the European Union. Is that what we are ready to do? To collectively use our diplomatic resources for that particular endeavor. It is obvious on certain areas like climate diplomacy. It is obvious in certain areas like trade, but probably it also goes beyond climate and trade. And the fourth element of the crisis is, of course, economic policies. Now, if you actually look back into the Biden administration, there were certainly tensions on trade to a certain extent. There were certainly different tools of economic policy being used for trying to achieve similar objectives. But the fundamental direction of policy was going in the same place. It was the climate transition, it was the need to regulate digital platforms. This is a totally different world with the new US administration, which has going to be embarked in a major deregulation exercise, doesn't believe in the climate transition. Let's see exactly what kind of policies they applied on the digital world. And of course, this is happening at the same time, at a moment in which both in the European Union and in the United Kingdom, there is a concern about the low rate of growth. Strong interest to see what needs to be done to be able to still achieve our objectives on climate, our objectives on AI, on digital, but to do it in a manner which is less costly. So I think there's a lot of interest in maybe also to look at this point in time to how far you can have a stronger regulatory cooperation between the UK and the EU. So that is the overall picture, which, as I said, in my view, goes well beyond trade. And it also implies that if you actually want to respond to needs, you are really going to have to go beyond traditional trade diplomacy. You are going to have to look into a much more cohesive use of different instruments, which is going to be a bit of a challenge for the European Union because you get into certain areas where you immediately are also depending on what is going to be the position of the member states. So that is, if you want, the overall setting. Now, if you look more specifically into trade, and I could be very short and just simply quote Alan Beattie, the journalist from the Financial Times, and to say, no one knows anything. This is a totally unpredictable world. Don't pretend that you have any clue about what the Trump administration is going to do on trade. And I think to a certain extent he's right, but I have been asked to come here and to give a talk, so I need to look a little bit into the crystal ball and give you a sense about what could potentially happen. At the end of the day, it might be less or it might be more, but I think at least I should share with you some sense about the type of risk that we may be facing on the trade front. Now, there has been, by the way, a trade memorandum that has been published the day after the inauguration, or 2 days after the inauguration. Those of you who are amateurs on trade are encouraged to read it. Every possible action that the United States can take on trade is listed there. And all of these possible actions, there is supposed to be a report by the 1st of April with recommendations to the President about what to do. I don't think I have found anything which is not actually included in that trade memorandum. So how all of this would be declined, what would actually be done, at this point in time is anyone's guess, as Alan Beattie would say. But I would say that from my point of view, the most significant issues that one would have to be looking forward are 5. One is this idea of a universal tariff. That is to say, something which would be applied on all products, on almost all products, and on all countries, or almost all the countries. Now, according to some studies, I think by the Congressional Budgetary Office, if the United States was going to apply a tariff of 10% across the board, this could raise revenue of almost $2 trillion over a 10-year period of time. So it's not peanuts. I mean, it's not something that is going to allow the United States to eliminate the income tax. That is certainly not peanuts. At the same time, such a tariff would have no impact on the trade deficit of the United States because it would be corrected to the effect of exchange rates. It may even be that the trade deficit increases because if it goes together with an overall reduction, an overall increase of the budget deficit, it may be that the deficit increases. But the fact that it can actually increase revenue might make such an option attractive to the United States. And you have heard some people in the US administration, including the new Treasury Secretary, making very clear that raising revenue is one of the objectives that is going to be pursued by this administration, and that tariff is going to be a tool for raising revenue. Now, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. It is not clear what will be the level of the tariff. It is not the same, for instance, to say it will be a minimum tariff of 10% and to say tariffs are going to be increased by 10 percentage points. The economic consequences are fundamentally different. Just to give you an example, if you look into a sector like chemicals, I think that the tariff in the United States is, at this point in time, I think 5.5. Moving from 5 to 5 to 10 would be a problem, would not necessarily be a disaster. Moving from 5.5 to 15.5 would basically eliminate chemical trade between the United States and the European Union. And it is not clear whether any such tariff would be adopted through executive action or through legislative action. Of course, this is a difference that matters, because if it's something which is done by the executive, it is easier to reverse. If it becomes part of law in the United States, then well, a lot of things will have to change in the Congress for that measure to be reversed. So again, this is potentially the more broader type of tariff action that could be imagined. At the same time, there have been signals that apart from an uniform tariff, there may well be increase of tariffs in certain manufacturing sectors. There is, of course, steel and aluminium, which were very subject to increased tariffs under the previous administration, but there have been indications that the United States may look also into increasing tariffs on cars, tariffs on pharmaceuticals, tariffs on legacy semiconductors. There you probably will be thinking about relatively high tariffs. Third issue is what we have been witnessing, that is to say the use of tariffs not for a protective objective or for a revenue objective, but as an exercise of leverage on non-trade objectives. That's basically what has been threatened vis-a-vis Canada, Mexico, Colombia, and China. And you may see more of that. Sometimes through powers that can be implemented very rapidly, other times through more traditional tools of trade policy, like Section 01 of the United States. And something which has been quite interesting is how little we have heard about China since Trump was elected. During the campaign, there was a lot of talk about increasing tariffs vis-a-vis China to 60%, or by 60%, which would probably imply full decoupling between the Chinese and the American economy. There has not been such signal being given since the election. So one can always speculate, and as I said, things can change, but it might be that the preferred approach of the United States would be to start with a relatively small tariff increase and to use it as a leverage to try to get bilateral market access concessions from China. And that, of course, could potentially put the Europeans in the worst of both worlds, because on the one hand, they would be facing direct threats from the United States, and they will also be facing problems of access into the Chinese market. Everything that I have mentioned so far is fundamentally action by the United States, not based on agreements with third countries. But of course, it is also likely that there will be some activity in the field of trade agreements. The priority will most likely be reviewing the USMCA, probably reviewing it in the direction of making it much more difficult to trade for Chinese companies that have invested in Mexico to benefit from USMCA. We will be tightening those kind of requirements. And my sense is that it is going to be very difficult to imagine that the United States will be ready to negotiate bilateral trade agreements which are not deeply asymmetrical. Asymmetrical in the sense of being limited in terms of what it is the United States is ready to offer in terms of improved access to its market, and very demanding in terms of what the United States would be asking in the return. Happy, of course, to go in more detail when we actually come to the questions. So, as I said, this is just my overview about what I think are the potential challenges that they are going to be facing on the trade world. Now, how should the European Union respond? Here I'm going to talk only about the European Union. Of course, I think it will be interesting to hear from some of you if you have any sense about how the United Kingdom should respond. So my recommendations here would go directly, primarily to the European Union. First, it is clear that one would reach as much as possible to avoid a major transatlantic trade conflict, particularly at a point in time when the issue of the security in Europe is of paramount importance, and trying to maintain the unified front in relation to the situation in Ukraine is going to be of critical value. So I think obviously the effort by the European institutions will be to engage, to see to what extent it is possible to avoid a major trade conflict. In terms of engagement, my recommendation to the European Union institutions is to be able to offer to the United States things that facilitate trade, that also happen to be in any case in the European interest, and to avoid offering things that further weaken the multilateral trading system or that somehow compromise the autonomy of European Union trade policy. So those would be the two parameters that I would recommend. What it is that can be done in that context, I mean, some of the issues are relatively obvious. President Trump has indicated his interest on selling more oil and gas into the European Union. The European Union is still importing significant amounts of liquefied natural gas from Russia. It happens, by the way, to be cheaper than US LNG. So I would imagine that the obvious thing to do would be to open a dialogue with the United States to see to what extent the United States is ready to provide guarantees of supply of LNG to the European Union. And if that is the case, for the Commission to go to the Member States and to say maybe the time has now come to further tighten the sanctions which are applied to Russia in the LNG sector. So that would be something that would make sense from the European Union point of view, that would also facilitate trade with the United States and would actually keep transatlantic cooperation to increase pressure on Russia. It would be necessary to come to any kind of negotiations on putting a stop, or at least provisionally, to the war. Now, the second area is even more obvious. As I mentioned before, Europe needs to be able to assume much greater responsibility for its defense, including both the European Union and its member states and the UK. There's going to be a NATO summit, I think, in the late spring. And between now and then, one would hope that there would be clear indications of the willingness of European countries to spend more on their defense. And that together with the previous actions on LNG, those two elements would show that it would make no sense in that context to open up a major trade conflict with Europe. Now, let's be clear, is this actually going to solve the trade deficit between the United States, between the European Union, between the United States and the European Union? Absolutely not, because any economist would tell you the trade surplus that the European Union has with the United States has nothing to do with trade policy. No way that tariffs are going to solve that deficit. It has to do with macroeconomic realities, which is the savings investment imbalance. But I also think that Europe should be ready to do is to proactively encourage discussions in the IMF about macroeconomic imbalances, both deficit and surpluses, and that could also be a way to put further in the European Union agenda those things that can be done that would actually reduce the European Union surplus. It is capital market union, it is regulatory simplification so that more European savings can be invested in Europe instead of being invested abroad. So that's again something that is in the interest of the European Union to do, and that can also create a different type of approach to tackle into this issue of macroeconomic imbalances. Now, if you notice, all of these issues are issues that have very little to do with trade policy. I mean, if you really wanted to make progress on that, the Commission can be pushing forward, but I mean, at the end of the day, if it comes to applying sanctions on Russia, the decision will have to be taken by the member states of the European Union. If it comes to defense, again, it's certainly not the European Commission as such who is going to take decisions on defense. And if you are talking about macroeconomic policies, in a way, it is also fundamentally the member states. There's the debt break in Germany. So all of this really requires being able to work in a quite different manner than in the past, when it was a much more focalized trade conflict. Of course, there will also be a number of more classical trade issues that will need to be discussed. We all know that there are certain sectors that are very totemic, that are going to be very much in the center of attention in the United States. There is steel, there is cars, apparently now pharmaceuticals. That seems to be the new obsession, that the exports of pharmaceuticals from Europe to the United States have very significantly increased. Mostly American companies that have invested in Europe for fiscal reasons are now exporting to the United States from Europe. Again, that is likely to also be a sector where along those you could have a more traditional, classical type of discussions to try to identify how to try to find mutually satisfactory solutions. Now, all of this is, of course, a policy of engagement, but I have to say that we need to be realistic and think that some form of tariff action impacting on Europe, it is very likely to happen. Hopefully, it would not be the worst type of action, but some form of tariff action is likely to happen. And I don't think that Europe will have any credibility if you are not prepared to respond. I mean, obviously, the preference would be to avoid retaliation, but if it comes to a point in which these discussions do not result in a satisfactory agreement and we are facing tariffs, I think that we did, in fact, we would need to be ready to retaliate, and I'm sure that my ex-colleagues in the European Commission have, of course, been working on being prepared for that eventuality. Now, how much we are on time? How much time left?
5, 6.
Yes. Well, then I would leave the more details on retaliation for the questions, because you might. I was planning to give a few hints about how I would recommend.
Why don't you do it? We've got time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my basic recommendation on retaliation would be, if the United States introduces an across-the-board tariff of about 10%, which is non-discriminatory in nature, which applies to all countries or to most countries, my recommendation would be that the European Union, with as many affected countries as possible, take a case to the WTO. Use the time of a case of the WTO, which would be maximum 1 year, to, on the one hand, evaluate the impact, prepare the retaliation list, and to continue the discussions to see where the issue can be solved without needing to deploy the retaliation. If it is that kind of action, of course, if it is higher than 10%, if it is discriminatory, then obviously the negative impact would be much greater, and then probably I would advise a more rapid retaliatory response. If what we are facing is something similar to what we faced in the previous administration, that is to say, high tariffs on some important sectors for the European economy, like cars, like potential pharmaceuticals, like higher tariffs, even more than it is today, on steel, then I think we should be able to retaliate very rapidly, I would say almost immediately, although we should never be the first one to retaliate. And I mentioned that because for you to be aware, there is a retaliation that has already been approved formally by the European Union in reaction to the steel and aluminium tariffs. This retaliation has been suspended until the end of March. So by the end of March, and the Commission proposes to the Council to extend the deadline, this retaliation would apply automatically. At this point in time, I think it's unlikely that there would be new tariff actions vis-à-vis the Europe before the end of March, in which case I would support, or I would argue, let's give more time, let's have an extension of this deadline to be able to have more time to try to find a possible solution in the steel sector and to avoid problems in other sectors. And then, of course, we need to be also facing potentially in a scenario in which the United States decides to take coercive action. That is to say, to apply tariffs not for a particular trade objective, but to put pressure on quite unrelated matters, where it is military expenditure, where there are some territorial claims, and that they may decide to do that not vis-à-vis the European Union, but vis-à-vis certain member states of the European Union. If that was going to happen, I think in my view, there's a legal instrument that was developed during the previous commission called the anti-coercion instrument. And in that type of circumstances, in my view, it would be perfectly justified to make recourse to the anti-coercion instrument. So I would say the type of reaction would very much have to depend about what is the type of threat that you are facing, how significant is the negative impact that it would have on the European interest. And I think that you will need to be ready to respond to different eventualities. So just then very quickly, but I'm sure that Charles will probably want to talk more about the reset, which is a topic that we both like very much. Let me come back to what I said in the beginning. I think if you look into the type of uncertainties about the transatlantic relationship, if you look into the impact it's going to have on security, on foreign policy, on economic policy, I would argue that the UK and the European Union are absolutely natural partners. Of course, the UK may feel that they are a little bit less exposed than the European Union, because the UK is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't actually have a trade surplus with the United States. So from that point of view, there might be a sense that perhaps the UK is a bit less exposed. But I think basically, if you look into geopolitical positioning, if we look into foreign policy, if we look into economic policy, I think there is a strong confluence of interests between the UK and the EU. And that's why I think, from my point of view, the reset really matters. I think it might be a huge wasted opportunity if there is a summit sometime in the spring, and this summit does not identify a way forward about how the UK and the EU should cooperate on security, on foreign policy, and on trade, and identify a clear roadmap, if you want, about what needs to be done also on the trade side. I mean, I have written on that, and I'm happy to also come into issues if you want in the discussion, but I will not enter here into the details. But I would also suggest it would be important to look at the reset not purely as a bilateral objective to facilitate trade between the UK and the European Union, but also as an opportunity for the UK and the EU to much more effective join forces to tackle the global challenges. And that's why I don't know exactly how, but in my view, apart from any negotiations on issues like fish, like spare trade area agreement, like the ETS, agreeing that there has to be some forum for the UK and the EU to cooperate more closely on three fundamental questions. One is how to deal with global trade challenges and economic security challenges, which are increasingly interlinked. The second is how to deal with international climate diplomacy in the circumstances in which the US is abandoning the Paris Agreement. And thirdly is how to discuss the new regulatory challenges, major new regulatory challenges that are going to be faced by both the UK and the European Union. Not necessarily always with the idea that you would identify the same way forward, but ensure that you have a forum and the possibility to discuss globally those big regulatory challenges. So I think I would leave it at that, and yeah, we're interested, Charles, to hear your comments.
Great, thank you very much. I have a good diagnosis of the problems and potential of Trump trade tariffs, the EU position, and how it might respond, and a case made for broad-based cooperation between the EU and the UK. Charles, if you could.
Thanks very much. One brief comment on the UK being stuck between Europe and America. Another brief comment on China, and then a slightly longer comment on the recess. So far, at least, Elon Musk doesn't seem to be selling Donald Trump's foreign policy. It's early days, of course, but Starmer's had a phone call with Trump, and David Lammy's had a phone call with Rubio, and they both went pretty well according to the US briefings anyway, so that's good that Trump isn't the same as Musk on foreign policy. However, on the right of UK politics and the right of US politics, there's a school of thought that says the UK is going to have to choose. That we're led to believe that Trump eventually will want the UK to, will offer the UK some sort of special deal, perhaps lower tariffs than apply to the EU, perhaps elements of some sort of trade agreement on condition that the EU that the UK distance itself from the European Union. That is a fear and a threat, and some people close to Trump have been saying that. They're not Trump themselves so far. And then you read people like Juliet Summerlin and Daily Telegraph saying, if we're faced a choice like that, we have no, it's not a choice, we have to go with the Americans, because our intelligence cooperation with the Americans is so strong, we'd have to distance ourselves from the EU and work with the Americans, get a special deal, preserve that intelligence cooperation. I disagree. I think, obviously, Keir Starmer says, as any British Prime Minister would and should say, we don't have to choose. We want to be friends with America, we want to be close, have close relations with our European partners too. And I think Starmer's right to say that. But if the worst comes to the worst and Britain is asked to choose, I don't see Starmer doing what Juliet Summerlin says. I don't see Starmer doing that at all, because for the reasons that Ignacio has explained, Britain's fundamental interests on most, if not all, issues are lined up with those of the Europeans. Nearly half our trade is with Europe. We both believe in the rules-based global trading system. We both believe in international organisations, the United Nations and global governance. We both want to support Ukraine firmly against Russia. We both believe that NATO is important. And I'll come back to China in a minute, but on China we have quite a similar approach of wanting to engage with China and not see China as an enemy. So, climate change, of course, we have very similar views to the European Union on climate change. We care about the Paris agreements and other climate diplomacy. So I don't see Starmer doing what some people on the right of British politics think he should do and ban the EU and line up with the US. However, now a word on China. I do think China worries me a bit. The British relationship with China could create real tensions between the British and the Americans. Starmer's got a clear line on China. His government you could argue it's similar to the line taken by the previous Conservative government. James Cleverly, when he was Foreign Secretary, set out a China policy in May 2023 saying, criticise China when it does bad things, but engage with it on climate, on trade, on finance, on health, and don't isolate China. That is more or less the line of the Starmer government as well, but the difference is that the Starmer government can actually apply that more forcefully than the previous government, because there's no China research group in the Starmer government, there's no Tom Tugendhat and Ian Duncan Smith arguing for a harder line on China. The Labour Party is quite soft on China, and they're taking the reset of China more seriously than Rishi Sunak's government did. I mean, Lammy was there last autumn, Reeves has just been, Starmer may go. When I was in Washington in December, I think there was a lot of criticism of the Starmer government for being too close to the Chinese. I was in the State Department and the NSC, I was told that the British government is engaging for engagement's sake. They shouldn't do that. I'm uncomfortable with this, which is frankly pretty hypocritical because the US engaged with China all the time. Jake Sullivan's been there about 6 times. That was the National Security Advisor replied that the US trades enormously with Chinese. So I think American criticism of the British for engaging too much with China is a bit unfair, really. Nevertheless, we don't know what Trump's going to do, as Ignacio said. We don't know what Trump's going to do on China. When I was in Washington, I asked everybody what Trump would do on China, and nobody had the faintest clue. It may be he gets tougher eventually. In his first time in office, he was soft to begin with, then got tougher when COVID happened. Maybe he seems to be starting off quite softly, he may get tougher. If he does get tougher, it could be difficult for the Brits. Remember during Trump's first presidency, he got tough on the British over Huawei. The British intelligence services said that having Huawei provide the 5G equipment for Britain didn't really pose a security risk, but then the Americans threatened to reduce intelligence cooperation and the British changed their mind. Huawei was ripped out of our telephone systems at a cost of several £billion to the British taxpayer. So it could be very difficult again, I think. Europe, of course, faces similar problems with the US over China. I mean, the Europeans do believe in engaging on China. They're not very united on China, but they all believe in engaging to a greater or lesser extent. The Germans are the biggest engagers, of course. But during the last commission, the last 5 years of commission, there was a big argument over the so-called economic security strategy, Europe's ESS. Driven by Sullivan, the EU tried to come up with ideas for limiting transfers of sensitive technologies to China and also outbound investments going towards China. The Germans and others fought back and kind of forced von der Leyen to withdraw these measures. But they're going to come back, and von der Leyen, in her second term, plans to come back to the ESS. So she's trying to push the Europeans to be tougher than they really want to be on China. But Trump could push her and them to be even tougher still. But maybe not, we just don't know. Let's wait and see. Finally, a word on the reset. I'm going to start off by being quite pessimistic, but finish on a more optimistic note. And I think that the need for an economic reset is pretty clear. The economy is about 4% smaller than it would otherwise be, according to the ONS. Exports of goods are down by 11% between 2019 and 2023. Imports down 7%. And when I go to Brussels, I find a growing frustration amongst EU officials about the slowness of the Starmer government to get its act together on Europe. It is being very, very slow to work out what it wants, to demonstrate to Europeans that it's prepared to come up with some bold ideas and stand up to its critics. And it's certainly very slow to make the case to the British people that they would benefit from more economic engagement and more closer security relationship. And as Ignacio rightly says, they need to start off by giving a signal. The 2 signals they need to give are they're prepared to talk about youth mobility, they're prepared to talk about fish. The Germans won't agree to any kind of reset unless there's a deal on youth mobility of some sort. The French won't agree to any sort of reset unless there's a deal on fish. I think the French will be satisfied if there's as many fish as they can pull out of the waters today. So I think the pressure from the EU is in many ways justified on those issues. And I think Starmer needs to signal that he's prepared to talk about them. If there's going to be a summit in the spring, date not yet fixed. The whole idea of the summit was to approve a pact on security cooperation, a non-binding pact modelled on the EU, Norway pact, which is a good idea. But the French are saying no to that unless they get what they want on fish. And then the whole idea of the summit is they'd agree the pact on security, and then they'd move on to set an agenda for improving the economic relationship. But that's the really difficult thing. Because the UK just doesn't really know what it wants on the economic relationship. Yesterday, I just discovered quite an important institution called the UK Cabinet Subcommittee on Europe met for only the second time since the general election. That's where the key ministers and the Prime Minister talk about Europe policy. They've only met twice since the election, the second time was yesterday. That tells you it hasn't been anybody's top priority. If you look at the top of the British government, there aren't very many figures in it who know much about the EU, who care very much about the EU either. And I think Keir Starmer is naturally a cautious person, but the real reason for their excessive caution, as I see it, is they're very scared of Reform UK. Reform UK came second to Labour in 89 seats in the British Parliament. in the last election campaign. And as far as I can see, the Labour leadership is basically focused on seeing off the threat from Reform UK. They think that if they talk about Europe too much or too warmly, they'll lose votes to Reform UK. In a way, they're fighting the next general election campaign, although it's 4 years away. They don't seem to worry about the Liberals at all, the Greens on the other side of them. In fact, both the Tory and the Labour parties are obsessed with Reform UK, and they're both seeing Reform UK as their main rivals at the moment. It's not just being scared of Reform UK, it's also there's a problem with decision making at the heart of the Labour government, and this doesn't just apply to Europe policy, it applies to all policies. I'm told by people on the inside that Number 10 can't coordinate the various ministries and knock heads together and get them to take a clear line. The result is there isn't a clear line on Europe at all at the moment, but I hope it'll come. And let me finish by looking a bit, sounding somewhat more optimistic. I think that the red lines, we all know what they are: no single market, no customs union, no freedom of movement. They won't change, but I still think a significantly better deal is possible which respects those red lines. And I think that the UK will probably go for it. They'll go for, I hope, for what I call a sectoral approach. The key thing for me is SPS. That's a veterinary agreement on plant and animal health. Macroeconomically, it's not very significant if we do a deal on that, but it's hugely important politically, I think, because if we do a deal with the EU on SPS, similar to the Swiss agreement, so that we basically remove the border controls on food and plants and animals going across the border, it wouldn't just make life easier for farmers, although it would set a precedent, because the EU won't agree to such a deal unless the British accept dynamic alignment, meaning following EU rules whenever the EU rules change, and some sort of role for the Court of Justice. That's an important precedent. If you do it on SPS, you can do it on other areas too. I think energy is the next one I'll look at. Also, of course, it is cherry picking. The EU keeps on saying we don't want the British to cherry pick. You can't be in the single market unless you're in all of it. You can't be in parts of the single market. But of course, if there's a deal on SPS, we would in practice be in that part of the single market without being in other parts. Because the EU would agree to have the cherry picked. It's in the EU's interest to let that happen. It would also have implications in relation to the US, because if you do a deal with the EU on SPS, and I think Starmer's government will do such a deal, then you can't do a trade deal with the United States. Because the US won't do a trade deal with the UK unless the UK opens its farm markets to American exporters of farm products. But if we do a deal with SPS with the EU to keep out chlorinated chickens and so on, and hormone-treated beef, then we can't open our markets to the US following EU standards. So it would force the British to recognise the reality which there isn't going to be an FTA for the EU in the US, in my view. So I think the way forward is one sector after the other. I do SPS first, then I do energy, where we have a lot of cheap wind power that the EU needs. And we benefit from a lot of undersea storage capacity for carbon capture and storage, which the EU could benefit from. But because we're not in the single market, we pay more for our electricity when we cross the channel than we should pay, we used to pay. So there's a clear mutual benefit, and we have to do a deal on merging the emission trading schemes quite soon. If we don't, British exports to the EU will pay a tariff under the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism the EU is bringing into force, and will start biting from next January. So there's a lot of mutual self-interest in doing a deal on energy cooperation. Bizarrely, the Commission came up with a paper at the end of last year saying we don't want energy cooperation, but I hope that was not too serious. So to conclude, I think the way forward is a sectoral approach, more and more dynamic alignment in many areas. If you do go for dynamic alignment, it doesn't mean you get access to the single market automatically. Even if Britain unilaterally follows EU rules on some sort of widget, we still need to, any British exporter would still need to produce paperwork at the border to show that the British goods complied with various EU standards and so on. But it would create a lot of goodwill, make the EU more flexible in other areas, I think, and it would be good for business because it'd be one set of rules for businesses instead of two sets of rules. And in the very long run, I am quite optimistic that we'll get a closer relationship, because I think the geopolitical context of Putin being a threat, Trump being a threat, the Middle East being in turmoil, China being a very aggressive country lined up with Russia is sufficiently alarming so that both the British and the continental Europeans need to work together on security, defence and foreign policy. I think many people in continental Europe, particularly those physically close to Russia, are very well aware of that. It's not their priority to give the British a better trade agreement. For some EU countries it is. I think for the Irish, the Dutch and the Belgians, they really want a better trade agreement. It's not for most countries, but if the British say if the British can make a good contribution to European security, and then they say we'd like a better trade agreement, some people would look more kindly on that. I'm not saying we should leave the one for the other. Theresa May made a big mistake in her Langston House speech in, I think, 2019, I forget which date it was, 2017. She more or less said, look, we're helping you on security, so give us a good trade deal. That wasn't very diplomatic. The answer to that was, if you can contribute to European security, that's in Britain's interest to do so, and it's good for your own security. Nevertheless, I do think if we contribute a lot to European security, it creates a climate of goodwill and trust, which makes the EU more likely to be flexible and listen to British demands for a better trade agreement. And stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just abuse the chair's privileges here and ask one question while the audience prepares themselves for questions. If I could pick up on one point, Ignacio, that you raised. How U.S. tariffs under Trump seem to have shifted from are used against centrist left sorts of governments. And I'm wondering if we can take it and extrapolate that point to say that the Maloney's of the world or other there will be rewards in being ideologically proximate to the Trump vision.
Well, it's an interesting thought. I mean, actually, before we came here, I was pointing out that it's somehow curious that all the initial threats that have been deployed by the United States have been directed towards governments which are progressive, if you want to use the word. I mean, to us, Canada, Mexico, Colombia. Not direct threats by Trump or Rubio against the United Kingdom.
Not yet.
Not yet. It was even. So I'm still not sure whether that means that the way that tariff policy is going to be determined is going to depend on the ideological alignment that certain countries actually have. I mean, also because I think that this administration knows, for instance, if the objective that they want to get through tariffs is somehow connected to trade, they have to deal with the European institutions. Italy cannot offer trade concessions to the United States. They don't have the capacity to do it. Now, of course, if the objective is something different than trade, it is actually, I would not mention potential objectives that have nothing to do. Then, of course, you might actually have a situation in which threats are directed towards certain member states and not vis-a-vis others, and that would be a critical moment to show that there is European Union solidarity and there is a willingness to react to support member states that could be negatively impacted. But I would say, in my view, there is a strong revenue motivation. And that's why I think the idea that there would be tariffs that would apply across the board to practically everyone, at least a starting point, is something that one needs to be prepared seriously for that. And then is, of course, particular trade grievances for which more targeted tariffs are likely to be used. Again, in certain cases, on a universal basis, if the United States decides that it wants to protect further its car sector, it's not going to be exempting any countries for a car tariff. Probably even those countries that have a free trade agreement, they may be subjected to additional tariff in the sector. Which brings me, by the way, to two issues that you mentioned, Charles, if I may just comment briefly on them. I mean, I'm not here to provide any kind of advice to what the United Kingdom should do in terms of negotiating or not negotiating a trade agreement with the United States, but I think it's very important that any decision is done with good knowledge of the implications. And for me, it's very clear that any trade agreement which is negotiated with the United States will be extremely demanding on the agriculture sector, not only on the regulatory side, but also on opening of the market. And that's something that you need to be prepared to if you want to engage in that kind of discussion. And what you are going to be able to obtain in exchange is going to be rather limited in nature. And perhaps one thing that it is also interesting to note, countries that have a free trade agreement with the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Colombia, have been the first one that have been threatened by tariffs, with tariffs by Trump. So the degree of insurance that you get through a trade agreement with this administration, you need to be conscious about that. And of course, it's not only going to be a question of alignment with the European Union, it's also going to be a question of alignment on the policy on China. It is very difficult to imagine that the United States will be ready to conclude trade agreements without including the high degree of alignment on the policy vis-à-vis China. And while there may well be areas where this administration might be more flexible than the previous one, I'm not so sure that they are going to be escalating a lot on issues like export controls. Maybe yes, maybe not. And one thing that would not be tolerated is that Chinese companies invest in a third country and use a third country as a platform to export to the United States. That is something which I'm quite convinced that they will not accept that happens with Mexico or Canada, and they may introduce restrictions when any country they can identify that Chinese companies are evading high tariffs by manufacturing in a different country. So that's something that I think you also need to bear in mind. On the reset, I basically agree with everything that Charles has said, so I will stop here.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Audience, if you could identify yourself and then keep your questions sort of sharp and clear. Let's start here and then over there.
David Hennig, European Centre.
We've got a mic circulating, sorry.
Okay. David Hennig, European Centre for International Political Economy. I wonder, Ignacio, if you've slightly underplayed the chaos factor on Trump. So your presentation sort of made it all quite neat. He might do this, he might do that. What about the cases where he wakes up in the morning, threatens tariffs, unthreatens? How do you cope actually with the chaos that you don't know what's going on? And one from the EU point of view, and secondly, but I don't know whether you want to pass this on to Charles, is the UK system even capable? I think the EU system might be capable, but how do you cope with it? For Charles, really, is the UK system even capable of that? Or is the UK system, given what you just said, Charles, about not coming up with a decision, is the UK system just going to go into a bit of a breakdown if Trump kind of threatens the UK on something?
Great, and then question over here. Maybe a third, if there's a third out there.
I've got two questions, if I...
That's cheating.
Okay.
Simon Lee, Simon Freelance Journalist. The first question relates to the reset and to what extent the UK and the EU need to be aligned if they, in return to retaliation. We already saw the UK declining to follow the EU on EV tariffs against China the other day. The EU might choose to retaliate against the US, but it might also choose to put further tariffs on China in line with Charles Grant's colleague at Central Reform at very interesting paper the other day, suggesting that actually the EU should do that anyway, in terms of preventing dumping from China. So if the UK decided not to follow EU policy, would that cause tensions in any way with the reset? And then the second question, you talked about the need for the Europeans to reach out to the global south and try to preserve the multilateral system. But the EU is also contemplating a not quite universal tariff, but it is contemplating a pretty substantial, important tariff with the CBAM. To what extent does the EU's own tariff policy potentially go against that important objective?
Let's actually take that as two sets of questions. We'll come to other speakers around the room.
Well,
I think we'll just,
okay. Well, I mean, first on the question by David about the chaos theory. Yeah, I mean, as I said, you need to be prepared for everything. And because you need to be prepared for everything, the best approach is that you look into all the worst case scenarios and you know that you have a way of responding to them. And that's a bit what I did in my presentation. So what are the worst case scenarios? Universal tariffs. Of course, much worse if it is actually higher and discriminatory, because if everyone is subject to the same tariff, there's an impact, but it's not the same as if some of your competitors are not subject to a tariff. So you need to be prepared to all the scenarios. You need to be prepared to very high tariffs on certain sectors. You need to be prepared for coercion. I mean, those are the three types of scenarios which might happen. And of course, it might be that it is much less than that. I mean, that's why I think that at this point in time, in my view, you need to be prepared for the worst. One thing which is a little bit of an issue is that at least in the first Trump administration, after the initial period of chaos, there was more stability because you have a clear driving force. Bob Lighthizer that has not got himself into the position that he wanted to be. And at this point, it is very difficult to know where is going to be the center of gravity of trade policy. Is it going to be Mr. Lutnick in the Commerce Department? Is it going to be Mr. Besant in the Treasury Department, which apparently they don't like each other a lot? So how is all that going to play? There is a rather junior USTR. Is he going to be able to somehow impose himself? Is everything going to be decided by Trump on the win of the day? You need to be prepared for all the scenarios. But no, I think from the point of view of policy, the best remedy for uncertainty is to be prepared for the worst. And I think to do what you can to prevent the worst, but to be prepared to react if the worst happens. I don't think that the European Union would be expecting the United Kingdom to align itself on retaliation vis-à-vis the United States or on tariffs vis-à-vis China. We are not negotiating the customs union. We are not. We all, both of us have our independent trade policy. Of course, if there is the perception that the United Kingdom is trying to do whatever it can to find itself better treated than the European Union, that might create some degree of political limitation. So I think how these issues of engagement with the United States are handled by both sides, I think is going to be important, because I could imagine a scenario in which there could be somewhat concern that the UK is doing its best to ensure that they are not negatively impacted, and if that is the perception, that could have an impact on the visa. We understand that we are bigger than the UK. From that point of view, we have a bigger retaliatory power than the UK does. I mean, the last time when we had the steel and aluminium dispute, Japan was very negatively impacted by the steel measure, but they decided not to retaliate, where we decided to retaliate. On China, well, I mean, there's a lot of speculation about how much Chinese imports into Europe may increase if the United States decide to go to a 60% tariff across the board. That might happen. Personally, as I said, I'm not sure that that's going to be the central scenario, and I would be a bit more concerned about the risk that China gives preferential access to its market to the United States in sector which is harming our export interests in China. But of course, if there was going to be increased imports into the European Union, I mean, my expectation would be that there would be probably tariffs, but they would be done in a WTO compatible manner, like we did in the Ibéricos, and there are different tools that you can use to that purpose. I suspect that probably in certain sectors there will be not European Union pressure on the UK, but UK industry pressure on the UK to take a similar action, because otherwise, of course, a lot of the focus would go into the UK market. No, I agree with you that the fundamental challenge that Europe, and by the way also the UK, because the UK is also preparing to see one of the fundamental challenges that we have in engagement with developing countries is to try to find a way to make sure that we limit the negative impact of a number of measures which are fully legitimate, but at the same time they can create trade disruption in developing countries. And I think that there are a number of things that should be done in order to limit the impacts. For instance, I personally think that, although it's not part of the current CBAM as designed in the European Union, I personally think that the European Union to be able to exempt, at least temporarily, from this event, imports from these developed countries. I mean, that's something which I would argue would be something that can be done to limit the impact of Iran on those countries which are more vulnerable. And the European Union should be able to put much more resources into climate diplomacy. I mean, there are many countries in the developing world which are in the process of developing carbon pricing. You have it in South Africa, you have it in Brazil, and I think one should need to dedicate much more time and money to support those evolutions in developing countries. By the way, I also see this as a big opportunity for joint diplomatic cooperation between the UK and the EU. We would be the only two jurisdictions that have introduced a border carbon measure. The United States may introduce a totally protectionist border carbon measure. There's some legislation which has just been introduced in Congress and which will introduce a carbon fee, but not a domestic price on carbon. So there are a lot of bad things that can happen out there, but I think it would be important that we take seriously how to limit potential negative impacts on some developing countries on some of those measures. And it will be part of the diplomatic challenge to try to maintain the multilateralism alive. I think it was very, very remarkable when you actually had this, I think it was in the Council of Foreign Relations, no? This interview about what has been the reaction to Trump in many countries in the global south. And they seem to be much more positive than Europe, Korea, because they somehow feel that the status quo is not so satisfactory for them either.
Thank you. Yeah, over here. Do you want as well? Let's go there and then I'll do that.
Yeah, hi. I am. Well,
Yes, it's very fine.
very fine. Okay. My name is Robert Eaton. It's
Speak a little louder. We can't hear it as well here for some reason.
Definitely on science.
Okay, I'm an NSE alumni. I've been retired for 10 years, previously at the IMF. I'm interested in what the benefit would be to the EU to do a trade deal, a better trade deal with the UK, given that many European countries, particularly the large European countries, have economic difficulties at the present time. UK is, although it's obviously smaller than the EU, is still a big market, particularly if and it's a big if obviously the Labour Party's growth strategy takes off. Wouldn't there not be an interest in trying to get more trade with the UK to help boost European countries' growth? Maybe for the UK, maybe if Starmer was really interested in a reset, would he have sent Mandelson to Brussels rather than Washington? Given what you mentioned about the lack of EU knowledge within the UK government.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Patrick Flynn. I'm just an interested member of the public. Thanks very much for the discussion. We saw in the first Trump presidency that America withdrew from global trade somewhat, and we've seen countries like China prepare themselves for the second Trump presidency that we see now. Given that, there's a lot of talk about the Trump administration being more prepared and, they're going to be more pronounced in how they're going to approach things. Where do you see global trade, 4 years' time in the Trump presidency and the corresponding global macro picture?
And then I'll try to get that third over here, I guess.
It's a bit of a deep one. So regarding current issues, this is a question for Ignacio.
So who
Ignacio. No.
yeah, who are you? Can you just your name?
Sorry, Giovanni Palermo. Academia, masters in public policy, but now I'm in the private sector for the past 10 years. Regarding current issues, I understand you argued that more to be done with the WTO. Considering historical issues with the creation of the ITO, which led to the creation of the GATT, and today with Trump and BRICS, do you believe the current institutional setup is suffice to deal with the current matters, or do you believe we need a new Bretton Woods? And does a global war necessarily have to precede it?
Get you the next round.
Okay, well, did you start my chart and I wrote afterwards?
Okay, I've got very little to say. Just on the previous point about EV tariffs, I'm quite relaxed about the UK and the EU being in different positions because the UK, for a start, hasn't really decided what to do yet. It hasn't introduced tariffs on EVs, but it's thinking about it. It may not, it could possibly do so. It doesn't really know. The EU itself is also very divided as well. Although it did decide to introduce tariffs, they're probably too low to make much difference to the car industry in Europe. And the Germans and the Spanish are strongly against them, and other countries too. So both the EU is a bit divided anyway on the tariffs. As Ignacio says, we have different trade policies, so I think I'm fairly relaxed about that. On the question about Mandelson, I think he'd be wasted in Brussels because the British ambassador to the EU, Lindsay Appleby, isn't in the room when decisions are taken. He presses his face to the glass looking into COREPER. The tries to work out what's going on inside the room. If he's lucky, somebody comes out and tells him a little bit about what's going on. Mandelson will be wasted in Brussels, while he's sufficiently devious and sufficiently clever and operated to be quite useful in Washington.
Okay, well, how important is the relationship with the UK from the perspective of European Union growth? I mean, the fundamental determinant of European Union growth is going to be some domestic efforts. It's not going to be trade policy, it's going to be some domestic effort. That's going to be the critical issue to go into a better growth trajectory. But having an open trade policy is going to be also an important factor. Now, don't forget that I think the United Kingdom, according to David Hennig, I think is the second largest trading partner of the European Union, if you look both into trading goods and trading services. So the United Kingdom matters from the point of view of trade. Keeping the United Kingdom close from the regulatory point of view, it's also, I think, important for the European Union. But of course, let's not forget that there are other things in the world apart from trade. And as I said in the beginning, at this point in time, the contribution of the UK to the defense of Europe is absolutely an existential issue because the United States are going to be progressively moving away from the defense of Europe. I mean, hopefully progressively, but you need to be prepared to assume primary responsibility for defense, and there the UK is an absolutely key player. Now, that brings me, however, to the other question about what we can see happening on the global trade picture 4 years from now. First, I think let's be clear, when it comes to relationship with the United States and when it comes with relationship with China, we are not going to see improvements. I mean, hopefully we will not face the worst, so we could prevent a collapse of the trade relationship with either the United States or China, but it's not really realistic to expect that there's going to be significant new growth opportunities coming from the United States and China. But then you have the whole rest of the world. And there I would pay tribute to Peter Mandelson, who was my boss quite a few years ago, who developed a so-called Global Europe strategy that was started our policy of engaging in free trade agreements across the world. And I think that there's an opportunity now within the next 4 years to build upon that, to complete the Global Europe strategy, starting with Mercosur, which now has been done and needs to be delivered, but also looking into the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN, ideally India, although that's going to be very, very difficult. And I think if you look into all of those elements, you will have at least an insurance that no matter what happens in the United States, no matter what happens in China, you are trading globally with many countries around the world. And again, I suspect that would also be an approach that would be the one followed by the UK, and that's something that could also create opportunities for both sides to cooperate in certain regions like the Indo-Pacific. Well, in order to create a totally new global trade regime, you need probably to have an hegemon who is determined to create a totally new set of institutions who is ready to make sacrifices, because you have no hegemon if you are not ready to make sacrifices. Certainly the United States is not an hegemon anymore, that's very, very clear. I don't think that China has the capacity either to create a global trade regime around China. So in those circumstances, I think the best bet is to try to use the institutions that we already have, to see how you can improve their function, to see how you can reform them. And the right is not going to come certainly from the United States. The United States is not going to be there, or if it is there, it is going to be passive. China does not have the capacity to lead. I mean, we don't want the WTO or the IMF or the Paris Agreement to become China-dominated institutions. I don't think that that's really either what Europe or the UK would want. So I think, in my view, that really puts a big responsibility on the European Union, together with the UK, together with others, to try to promote as much as possible the functioning of the multilateral institutions that we already have. And again, it's not really going to work if you don't manage to go beyond the like-minded and you are not able to engage countries like Brazil, countries like Indonesia, countries like South Africa, and ideally, but that's going to be the toughest one, countries like India. And I hope you will work with China. You will be ready to work on all of those issues with China because China has an interest in also in keeping those multilateral institutions working. You know, hopefully you will be able to engage with the United States, but if the United States is not ready to engage, I think Adam Posen from the Peterson Institute said, if you are not ready to lead, follow, and if you are not ready to lead or follow, get out of the way. So basically, I think that hopefully you will be able to engage with the United States, but if the United States abandons the Paris Agreement, then you need to see how to keep climate diplomacy without the United States. And at the end of the day, the most fundamental players for climate policy is not the United States, it is China, it is India, it is Indonesia. Those are really the countries that matter in the next 5 years to keep the climate transition working forward, and that's where you should actually invest your resources and your priorities.
Charles, did you want to say something else about that?
That's fine.
Okay. Someone over here.
Yes,
There's a mic coming if you don't mind.
I have a loud voice.
But also, if you
No, I
tell us who
understand.
you are.
And so I'm Madeleine Tuinenga from the EU delegation, and I had the pleasure to work a lot with Ignacio. And thanks for both to you for the really extremely enriching and interesting presentation. I have two quick questions and observations. So, Ignacio, you spoke about this opportunity, you went to Global Europe and the opportunity that opens, and I think we saw that. And I was at the start of the EU-Mercosur negotiations back in 2000. They were concluded now, and the timing is quite obvious that there wasn't at the time to conclude them. But do you see the same opportunity for the WTO? Will we now see China as a big defender of the multilateral system? Will they jump in that gap? And then what I didn't hear, what we do hear around, is that Trump could effectively have 2 years' time to do what he wants. Because then you get the midterm elections and that goes on. So to what extent do we need to factor in that we, of course, need to look at the longer horizon, but that we need to manage a short-term thing where there will be a lot of hiccups and uncertainties through which we need to get, because there's 2 years, or it could also be that Trump manages to get a third term. We shouldn't have surprises in this respect.
Great. Other questions out there? Anyone else?
Well, Madeleine, you always put the toughest questions. I think the critical issue on the WTO is not so much US or China. China, I'm convinced that they will be ready to cooperate in any WTO reform initiative. The critical issue is how we can actually somehow change the dynamic in the WTO of countries like India, to a lesser extent South Africa and Brazil. Obviously, knowing that the WTO is an institution that requires consensus for anything to happen multilaterally, it's very difficult to imagine any consensus being reached in the next 4 years involving the United States. or maybe I'm exaggerating. There are certain issues in which I would expect that the United States would still be ready to cooperate in the WTO, for instance, fishery subsidies. If at the end of the day one managed to find a way of convincing India to leave its objection on fishery subsidies, I don't see the United States preventing an agreement on fishery subsidies in the WTO. So there are some things that maybe you can still get the United States on board, but you need to be able to see what it is that can be done, that can be probably agreed unilaterally, because it will be very difficult to agree in things multilaterally. And then the fundamental issue that you need to find some solution is how to respond to the objections that countries like India and South Africa are having against unilateral agreements in the WTO framework. Now, there's a ministerial meeting happening a little bit more than 1 year, which will be in Africa. And I think, in my view, the critical issue is going to be between now and then. Can the European Union, the UK, other countries work together with the Director General of the WTO to try to find a common platform that countries like Brazil, that countries like South Africa, and hopefully India, but that would be the toughest one, can support. It will not be something monumental at this point in time, but at least it will be a way of showing that the system is still alive and that most countries in the world want the system to be alive. Well, let's see what happens in the midterms. Quite frankly, I have to say that we have to be prepared for the possibility that we have seen a fundamental structural change in terms of the United States international policies, and that therefore we have to prepare for these type of uncertainties for a longer period of time. But you know, I think in a way we need to be able to show that, although obviously we would wish to maintain close alliance with the United States, if the United States is no longer supporting multilateral institutions, it is our responsibility to do that job. And we should be ready to do it, even if the US is not there.
I actually have another question, if you don't mind, which is, do you think the application, and for both of you, the application of tariffs, much like the constant or the use of sanctions, which has sort of a diminishing utility, or certainly over time, certainly there's been ducking, dodging, and what have you, that perhaps it's been poorly applied. But does the use of tariffs as in economic statecraft have systemic effects, the corroding effects on that? Does it are people trade diversification follows from that, and that sort of thing? What's the long-term prognosis if that is a tool?
Well, actually, if you look into the different objectives that potentially could be used for tariffs, tariff as a source of revenue has very, very strong limitations. So the idea that we are going to go back to the 19th century and that tariffs are going to become now a very significant source of revenue in advanced countries, I think is an illusion. So that I don't say that it might not help a bit in terms of the short-term budgetary discussion that would happen in the United States, but at the end of the day, the consequence of this is going to be the budget deficit in the US is going to continue to increase. And at some point in time, that's going to have macroeconomic consequences. I mean, how long? One will have to wait for this to have macroeconomic consequences, but there's a certain moment in which the US budget deficit will have a macroeconomic impact. Now, if you look at tariffs as an instrument to correct the deficit, no. Most likely it's going to be the contrary. I mean, if tariffs are applied very significantly by the United States, the dollar value is going to increase. As a result of that, exports are going to be reduced, and it might well be that at the end of the day, you end up the second Trump presidency with a higher trade deficit than they had when it started. I mean, it's what happened during the first Trump presidency, although then tariffs were used much less than now. And if you want to use that tariffs as a sort of leverage, well, you know, hard and naked power may work in the short term, but in the medium term, it fundamentally undermines your soft power. And look into a country like Colombia, how they probably feel about their relationship with the United States after what happens, and immediately who is going to be profiting from that? Certainly China, maybe the European Union, but I mean, if you exercise too much naked power, you may get some short-term advantages, but your own influence, your own power is going to diminish. It's going to limit about how far in the current multipolar world, because we are not living in a world where the United States is all powerful, but in the current multipolar world, how far you can try to get your objectives through the naked exercise of power, and tariffs are not such a powerful instrument. Okay, you cannot trade as much with the United States. You know, the world is big. You trade with tariffs.
Well, I've got nothing to add on tariffs except that I worked for The Economist for 12 years, so I'm against them. Two very brief final sentences from me. On the UK reset, I think the key point is that I'd like to make is that security and economics cannot be treated in isolation from each other. One affects the other quite seriously, and so that is why I'm in the long run optimistic about a better reset. I think the Starmer government's being very slow in trying to move towards it. Second point on China. I think there's been a lot of talk recently how China is part of an axis of autocracies alongside Russia, Iran and North Korea. And there is certainly China, Iran and North Korea are helping Russia in its war effort in Ukraine. But the difference between them is that Russia and North Korea and Iran are losers they're trying to disrupt the global system. They're not doing very well from the global system. China does very well from the global system. China is persuadable to accept multilateral rules for governments, at least in economic issues. I think the UK and the EU can help to push in that direction, so I haven't given up on China. It's fundamentally different from the other members of the axis of autocracies, at least on economic questions. And that's a very good thing.
Very
We actually are on the hour. I don't want to leave on a I think it's an optimistic note, I'm not sure.
It was optimistic.
Okay, good.
Don't give up on China.
But just to thank Ignacio for providing us with a clear-sighted analysis of the Trump trade possibilities, if not threats, certainly impacts on the EU, and giving us a sort of paving a road that might indeed bring the European Union and the UK more aligned in certain policy areas that would work for everyone. So, and also to thank Charles for giving us his insights and commenting on the questions that have been raised. So thank you very much for all. I also, two things before we leave. One is the obvious, if you haven't seen it, of course, Ignacio's publication with the LSE ideas is spread around the room, but also spread around the room is a little leaflet that you can fill in commenting on speakers and events. So that will help us in our work. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for coming.